The first warning Sardaukar received was the sound. Not the wail of proximity alarms. Not the thunder of orbital bombardment cracking through the fortress moon's reinforced atmosphere. The warning was something older, more primal. A sound that bypassed Klingon tactical training and reached directly into the hindbrain where instinct still lived. It was the sound of 3,000 voices chanting in unison, low and rhythmic and utterly without fear, rising from the tree line beyond the fortress perimeter like a tide that had been building for 10,000 years. General Korvac, commander of Sardaukhar's eastern garrison, was reviewing deployment rotations when his aide burst through the command chamber doors with blood already on his armor. The young officer's left eye was gone. In its place was a neat, cauterized wound, the signature of a blade heated to surgical precision, drawn across flesh by someone who had done it 1,000 times before and found it unremarkable. Contact, the aide managed. Eastern wall. They came out of the forest. Korvac was already moving. The eastern wall of Sardaukhar's outer fortress ring was 3 meters of solid duranium-reinforced stone, built to absorb orbital weapons fire and laugh at ground assault. 200 Klingon warriors manned its parapets, veterans of the Cardassians' border campaigns, soldiers who had earned their postings through documented kills and witnessed courage. They were not garrison troops in the dismissive sense. They were the best the Empire assigned to its most sacred fortress, the world where Klingon warriors received the highest military honors the High Council could bestow. They were dying. Korvac reached the eastern parapet in time to watch a Sardaukar warrior take a full disruptor blast to the chest at close range, stagger 2 steps from the impact, and drive a Kinjal blade through a Klingon soldier's throat with his offhand while his shield belt cycled back to full strength. The personal shield flickered, a shimmer of Holtzmann field distortion, visible even in daylight as a faint iridescence, like oil on dark water, and then solidified again as though the disruptor bolt had been a minor inconvenience. The Klingon warrior died confused. That, perhaps, was the most disturbing detail. Klingons did not die confused. They died furious or triumphant, or at peace with a blade in their hands. Confusion was not part of the vocabulary. But the Eastern Wall garrison had encountered something their training had never catalogued. An enemy whose personal defensive technology absorbed directed energy weapons completely, who moved with a fluid economy of violence that suggested not aggression but practice. The deeply grooved muscle memory of soldiers who had been killing since childhood and had never once lost the habit. The Sardaukar came over the wall in coordinated waves. Not the chaotic surge of warriors seeking glory, something colder, more geometric. Fire teams of 6, each moving to protect the other's flanks, each member anticipating the next by the slight shift of a shoulder or the angle of a blade. They communicated in clipped, guttural bursts that the universal translator would later struggle with, not a language designed for conversation but for combat coordination, stripped of every syllable that didn't convey tactical information. Korvac drew his batolith. He was not a small man. He stood 2 meters at full height, broad through the shoulders in the way that Klingon soldiers of his generation were built. Not through vanity but through decades of weapons drilling that had reshaped his body the same way water reshapes stone. He had killed Jem'Hadar in personal combat. He had fought Cardassians' ghouls who had trained their whole lives for war. He raised the batolith over his head and bellowed the war cry of his house and threw himself into the nearest cluster of Sardaukar with the absolute certainty of a warrior who had never met his physical equal. The Sardaukar sergeant met him with a shield belt shimmer and a blade that moved faster than Korvac expected. Not faster than he could track. Korvac was too experienced for that. But faster than the gap between tracking and responding, the critical half-second where observation becomes reaction. The Kinjal opened a line across Korvac's forearm, not deep enough to cripple but precise enough to send a message. The Sardaukar sergeant stepped inside his reach, used the batolith's own momentum against him, and put a knee into Korvac's ribs with mechanical efficiency. Korvac hit the parapet stones and came back up snarling. The sergeant was already watching him. Not the predatory anticipation of a warrior who smelled victory, something more unsettling. Evaluation. Clinical assessment. The sergeant was reading Korvac the way a scientist examines a specimen, cataloging his recovery speed, his grip adjustment, the way he redistributed his weight after absorbing the throw. The sergeant's eyes, visible above the lower edge of his battle visor, held no hatred and no excitement. They held professional respect. It lasted exactly 1 second. Then the sergeant came forward again, and Korvac understood with sudden and complete clarity that he was fighting someone who had been doing this since before he was born. Someone for whom battle was not a crucible of honor but a lifelong vocation as ordinary and practiced as breathing. Behind him, the eastern wall fell. Not catastrophically, no section collapsed, no breach was blown through the stone. It fell the way experienced commanders recognized as the most dangerous kind of tactical defeat. The garrison simply ceased to be able to hold it. Sardaukar fire teams cleared each parapet section methodically, moving from position to position with that same eerie geometric precision, never overextending, never taking unnecessary risks, bleeding the defense dry through coordinated pressure rather than overwhelming force. From somewhere deeper in the fortress complex, Korvac heard the chanting resume. 3,000 voices, low, rhythmic, patient as geological time. He activated his badge with bloody fingers and sent the emergency signal to the High Council on Konos, one word, the Klingon military code for a threat classification that hadn't been used in living memory. Not invasion, not assault, the old word, the one reserved for enemies that required the full weight of the Empire to answer. The word that meant, we have found something worthy of us. The emergency signal from Sardaukar reached the Great Hall on Konos 17 minutes after Korvac's bloody fingers transmitted it. It arrived during a session of the High Council that had been, until that moment, consumed with the comparatively mundane business of border disputes along the Cardassians' demilitarized zone. A matter of trade routes and territorial markers that 3 council members had been arguing about with diminishing patience for the better part of 2 hours. Chancellor Gowron received the transmission personally. Those present in the Great Hall would later describe what happened to his face when he read it as one of the more memorable things they had witnessed in careers defined by memorable things. The chronic intensity that Gowron wore like a second skin, those wide, burning eyes that always suggested a man perpetually on the edge of either inspiration or explosion, went briefly, completely still. Then something shifted behind them. Not alarm, not confusion, hunger. Clear the hall, he said quietly. When the assembled council members hesitated, processing the departure from protocol, he said it again at a volume that rattled the torch brackets on the stone walls. Clear the hall. Within 90 seconds, only his senior military advisors remained. General Martok stood at Gowron's right hand, reviewing the tactical feed from Sardaukhar's surviving sensor buoys with the focused economy of a man who processed battlefield information the way other people processed breathing. What the buoys showed was fragmentary, several had already gone dark, suggesting that whatever force had hit the eastern wall understood sensor infrastructure and was eliminating it methodically. But enough remained to construct a partial picture. 3,000 ground troops, minimum, Martok said. Possibly more in reserve. Personal shielding technology we have no classification for. Energy weapons that are not disruptors, not phasers, not plasma-based by any signature we recognize. Bladed weapons used in close combat with a proficiency, he paused. Martok did not pause often. With a proficiency that suggests primary weapons, not backup. They prefer the blade, Gowron said. They are better with the blade, Martok corrected. There is a distinction. The sensor feed flickered and showed, briefly, an ornithopter, a dragonfly-winged atmospheric craft unlike anything in the Klingon Defense Force's recognition database, sweeping low over the fortress's inner courtyard and deploying a fire team with rope-less precision drops. Each soldier hitting the ground in a combat-ready crouch as though the 30-meter fall were a minor inconvenience. Then the sensor buoy providing that feed went dark. Gowron studied the blank screen for a moment. Where did they come from? He asked. His science advisor, a young officer named Torith who had earned her position through a combination of brutal competence and the ability to deliver unwelcome information without flinching, brought up the astronomical data. There was a spatial anomaly detected in the Sardaukar system approximately 4 hours before first contact. Subspace distortion consistent with a dimensional rift, not a wormhole, not a natural phenomenon we have catalogued. Something tore open, Chancellor. These soldiers came through it. From where? Another universe, Torith said. Possibly another dimension entirely. The energy signatures don't match any known region of our galaxy. The Great Hall absorbed this information in silence. Gowron turned to Martok. How many warriors can we put on Sardaukar within 6 hours? 2 full battalions from the Borith garrison. Another from Khitomer. If we pull the honor guard from ceremonial rotation, pull them. Gowron's voice had taken on the quiet register that his advisors had learned to find more alarming than his shouting. And assemble the Fourth Fleet. Not as escort, as the primary strike force. He looked around the hall at the faces of his senior commanders, each one carrying the particular expression of Klingon military professionals presented with a problem that was simultaneously terrifying and deeply, genuinely exciting. We will not send enough warriors to defend Salusa. Martok understood immediately. We send enough to answer them. If they have come through a rift between universes to make war in Klingon space, Gowron said, then they deserve to know exactly what they have found. They will not learn that from a garrison. They will learn it from the full weight of the Empire. 4 light-years away, aboard the USS Enterprise-D holding position near the edge of the Klingon neutral zone for what had been scheduled as a routine diplomatic courier mission, Lieutenant Commander Data raised his head from his console with a particular quality of attention that indicated something had moved from background monitoring into active anomaly status. "Captain," he said, "I am receiving fragmented subspace transmissions from the direction of Salusa. Klingon military encryption, emergency classification. I am also detecting residual energy signatures from what appears to have been a significant dimensional breach event in that system approximately 4 hours ago." Jean-Luc Picard crossed the bridge from his command chair to the ops station with the measured pace of a man who had learned that moving faster than the information warranted rarely improved the information. He studied Data's screen. The energy signatures meant nothing specific to him at a glance, but he had spent enough years in command to recognize the shape of a situation that was about to become significantly more complicated. "Can you decrypt the Klingon transmissions?" "Partially. The encryption is current High Council military protocol. However, the fragments I can reconstruct suggest a ground engagement on Salusa involving an unidentified force with unknown technology." Data tilted his head precisely 3.2 degrees. The classification code used has not appeared in Klingon military communications in recorded Federation history. I am cross-referencing now. A pause of 1.4 seconds, substantial for Data. It translates approximately as Jaga, the Great Enemy. A designation reserved in ancient Klingon military tradition for an opponent considered worthy of the Empire's full response. Counselor Troy spoke quietly from her chair. "I'm sensing something, Captain. Even at this distance, through the interference, there's a quality to the emotional resonance coming from that system." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Excitement. From the Klingons. But underneath it, something I don't have a reference for. A collective emotional signature I've never encountered before." She looked at Picard. "Absolute certainty. Not arrogance. Certainty. As though whatever force is on Salusa has never once in its existence entertained the possibility of defeat." Picard held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned to the Khan. "Set course for Salusa," he said. Warp 8.
The prisoner had been taken at considerable cost. It required 11 Klingon warriors, 3 of whom did not survive the attempt, to bring a single Sardaukar Bashar into custody. And even then, the capture happened not because the Sardaukar was overwhelmed but because he chose, at some precise internal calculation, to stop killing and assess his situation. The warriors who restrained him would argue afterward, with the particular vehemence of soldiers who needed to believe something, that they had subdued him. Martok, reviewing the sensor logs later, said nothing to contradict them. The Bashar sat in the detention block deep beneath Salusa's inner citadel, one of the few sections of the fortress still fully under Klingon control. With his wrists in magnetic restraints and his back straight and his eyes moving across every surface of the cell with the slow, methodical attention of someone taking inventory. He had been stripped of his Kinjal and his shield belt generator. His battle armor remained. The Klingon medical officer had attempted to remove it for injury assessment and received a look that stopped the attempt more effectively than the restraints. He was not large by Klingon standards. That was the first thing that struck Commander Krell, Martok's intelligence officer, when he entered the detention block with 2 armed guards and a universal translator unit still cycling through its initial language acquisition protocols. The Bashar stood perhaps 185 meters, leaned through the torso in the way of soldiers who had been rationed hard and worked harder, with the particular quality of stillness that Krell associated with predators rather than prey. The stillness of something that was not afraid and was not bored but was simply waiting for conditions to change. Krell activated the translator. You will identify yourself and your commanding officer. The Bashar looked at the translator unit with brief, clinical interest. Then he looked at Krell. Then he looked at the two guards. His eyes moved across each of them with the same inventory patience he had applied to the cell walls, and Krell had the unsettling impression that he was being filed, catalogued and stored for later reference by a mind that forgot nothing. He said nothing. You are a prisoner of the Klingon Empire, Krell said. You will answer questions or you will be made to answer them. The Bashar's expression did not change. It had not changed, Krell realized, since he entered the room. It was not the blankness of someone suppressing emotion. That had a texture, a tightness around the eyes and jaw that experienced interrogators learned to read. This was something different. The Bashar's face held the quality of a weapon at rest. Not deactivated, simply not yet deployed. Krell leaned forward. What are you? Where do you come from? What is the purpose of this invasion? Silence. One of the guards shifted his weight. The Bashar's eyes moved to him immediately. Not threateningly, just registering the movement with the automatic precision of someone for whom situational awareness was as involuntary as breathing. The guard went very still. Krell changed his approach. He pulled up the sensor footage from the eastern wall engagement on a wall display, the Sardaukar fire teams moving across the parapets, the shield belts absorbing disruptor fire, the coordinated blade work that had dismantled a garrison of veteran Klingon warriors in under 40 minutes. He watched the Bashar watch the footage. Something moved in the Bashar's eyes. Not pride, something more complicated. The look of a craftsman evaluating completed work and finding it technically adequate while already identifying the inefficiencies. Your warriors fought with honor, the Bashar said. The universal translator took 4.3 seconds to process it, the language acquisition still building its matrix from the limited sample, and rendered the words in rough, accented Federation standard. The voice beneath the translation was low and precise, each syllable placed with the same economy the man applied to his blade work. Krell controlled his reaction carefully. You speak, when there is something worth saying. The Bashar looked at him directly for the first time. Your warriors fought with honor. Several of them were exceptional. The large one with the curved blade, he paused, and the translator struggled briefly with what followed. He understood distance management. He adjusted his grip correctly after the first exchange. Under different circumstances, in a different corps, he might have become something. General Korvik survived, Krell said. I know, no satisfaction in it, no disappointment, simply acknowledgement of a fact he had apparently already accounted for. The door opened behind Krell. He turned, and felt the specific quality of irritation that came from having an interrogation interrupted at a productive moment, followed immediately by the specific quality of reassessment that came from seeing who had interrupted it. Lieutenant Commander Worf had to duck slightly to clear the detention block doorway. He was in full Klingon ceremonial sash over his Starfleet uniform, a combination that managed to look neither incongruous nor compromised, simply like a man who existed in two worlds simultaneously and had stopped apologizing for it. He had arrived on Tygokor 40 minutes ago aboard a Klingon transport that Martok had requested specifically, telling Gowron that the presence of a Starfleet officer with Klingon instincts might provide a perspective that pure military intelligence could not. Worf looked at the Bashar. The Bashar looked at Worf. The quality of attention that passed between them was different from anything that had occurred in the cell before. Not the predator-prey assessment of the Bashar's earlier inventory. Something more reciprocal. Two people recognizing in each other a shared category of existence that had nothing to do with species or uniform or allegiance. Soldier, the recognition said. The kind that was made, not born. Worf dismissed Krell and the guards with a gesture. Krell began to object. Worf looked at him, and Krell reconsidered. When the cell was empty except for the two of them, Worf deactivated the translator unit. He reached into his uniform and produced, with deliberate slowness, a mek'leth, a shorter Klingon blade, single-edged, designed for close-quarters work. He set it on the floor between them and took 3 steps back. The Bashar looked at the blade, looked at Worf. For the first time, something shifted in his expression, not warmth, but the closest adjacent thing. Recognition of a language he spoke fluently. He looked at his restrained wrists. Worf deactivated the magnetic restraints. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not recorded on internal sensors. Worf had disabled them before entering. What emerged from those 11 minutes was Worf with a deep cut across his left shoulder that would scar beautifully, a Bashar breathing harder than he had during the entire Eastern Wall engagement, and the beginning of something that neither the Klingon Empire nor the Federation had a diplomatic category for. Understanding. You fight as though combat is prayer, Worf said, in Klingon, trusting the Bashar's evident intelligence to extract meaning from unfamiliar words through context. The Bashar was quiet for a moment. Then, in his own language, he said something the translator, reactivated afterward, rendered imperfectly but recognizably. On Salusa Secundus, it is. The shield belt problem nearly broke Klingon tactical doctrine in half. Martok recognized it within the first hour of analyzing the Eastern Wall sensor data, and the recognition carried the particular weight of a commander confronting not just a tactical complication but a philosophical one. Klingon warfare was built on a foundation older than warp technology, older than the Empire itself. The principle that courage and ferocity, expressed through direct physical engagement, constituted the highest form of military virtue. Disruptors and battle cruisers were extensions of that principle, not replacements for it. When a Klingon warrior closed distance with an enemy and brought blade to bear, he was participating in something sacred. The Sardaukar shield belts did not merely neutralize disruptors. They rendered that entire sacred framework temporarily incoherent. A Holtzman field, as the Enterprise-D science team would later reconstruct from sensor fragments, operated on a principle of kinetic discrimination. It stopped fast-moving projectiles and energy weapons completely while remaining permeable to slow-moving objects. A blade drawn at fighting speed passed through. A disruptor bolt did not. The field generated a faint iridescent shimmer around the wearer, visible at close range, that flickered and cycled with each absorbed impact. It did not require external power. The belt generator was self-contained, drawing from a miniaturized power cell that the Enterprise's initial scans suggested could sustain the field for approximately 72 hours of continuous use. Against Klingon warriors, this created a tactical paradox that was almost elegant in its cruelty. Warriors who charged with blades drawn could reach the Sardaukar. Warriors who opened fire with disruptors first, the instinct of soldiers trained on energy weapon doctrine, expended ammunition against shielding while the Sardaukar closed distance and killed them with kinjals. The natural Klingon response to an enemy with superior ranged defense was to press forward into close combat. But the Sardaukar were, demonstrably, exceptional close combat fighters. They had engineered a situation where every Klingon response played into their strengths. Martok spread the tactical data across the war room table in Tygokor's inner citadel and looked at it for a long time. Around him, his senior officers did the same. The silence had the quality of professionals absorbing an unwelcome lesson, not defeated, not panicked, but recalibrating with the grim efficiency of soldiers who understood that the first casualty of any engagement was your assumptions about the enemy. The shields respond to velocity, said Commander Torith, who had been transferred from Konos at Martok's request. She pulled up a tactical schematic she had constructed from the available data. Energy weapons are too fast. Standard blade attacks at combat speed pass through. But look at this. She highlighted a sequence from the sensor footage. A Klingon warrior, in the chaos of the Eastern Wall, had grabbed a Sardaukar soldier from behind, a grappling hold, not a blade attack. The Holtzman field had flickered uncertainly around the contact point. Pure grappling, no weapons, no focused kinetic attack. The field doesn't know what to do with it. You are suggesting we fight them as wrestlers, said General Korvik, who had arrived in the war room with his forearm sealed under a medical wrap and an expression that suggested the medical wrap was the only concession to his injury he intended to make. I am suggesting the field has a threshold, Torith said carefully. Distributed force across a large contact area at low velocity may fall below its discrimination parameters. Grappling, shield bashes, thrown debris at low velocity. She paused. It would require warriors to close distance under fire, absorb whatever the Sardaukar could bring to bear at range, and engage in a form of combat that is Undignified, Korvik said flatly. Effective, Martok said. He looked at Korvik. You fought their sergeant. Yes. Could you have killed him? Korvik was quiet for 3 seconds, an eternity by Klingon conversational standards. With a blade, at full engagement, one-on-one? He considered it honestly, with the unsentimental accuracy of a professional evaluating a professional. Perhaps. It would have required him to make a mistake. He did not appear to make mistakes. He touched the medical wrap on his forearm. This was not a mistake on his part. This was a message. What message? That he could have taken the arm entirely and chose not to. Korvik's voice held something complicated, not humiliation, but the specific unease of a warrior who had been shown mercy by an enemy and wasn't sure whether to be grateful or furious. He was telling me he had assessed me and found me worth keeping functional. For what purpose, I don't know. The war room absorbed this. They evaluate, Worf said from the doorway. He had arrived silently enough that 2 officers startled, a fact that would not appear in any official record. He crossed to the table and brought up the partial translation files from his session with the Bashar. Everything they do serves assessment. The Eastern Wall assault was not simply an attack. It was a measurement. They wanted to know what Klingon warriors are made of before committing to a full campaign strategy. Martok studied him. What did the prisoner tell you? His name is Bashar Saras. A Bashar is approximately equivalent to a colonel in Starfleet rank, a field commander responsible for a cohort of roughly 500 soldiers. He commands one of 6 cohorts that came through the dimensional rift. Worf paused. 3,000 warriors total, as our initial estimates suggested. They have additional forces staged near the rift egress point. He did not specify numbers, but the phrasing implied a reserve capability substantially larger than the initial deployment. Their objective? Assessment. Worf looked around the table. They serve something called the Padishah Emperor, a supreme ruler in their universe. When they encounter a new civilization, their doctrine is to evaluate its military capacity comprehensively before recommending a course of action. Conquest, alliance, or withdrawal. He let that settle. They have never recommended withdrawal. General Korvik leaned forward. They have never met Klingons. Bashar Saras said something similar, Worf said. Almost exactly those words, in fact. Though his tone suggested he considered it an interesting variable rather than a deterrent. The war room was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of silence that precedes a decision being made, not by one person but by a collective understanding arriving simultaneously at the same conclusion. Martok looked at the tactical schematic. The shield belt vulnerability Torith had identified, the grappling threshold, the Kinjal blade angles, the ornithopter deployment patterns. He looked at it all with the eyes of a general who had spent his career finding the crack in the wall that everyone else had decided wasn't there. Modify the batolith drills, he said. Close contact grappling integration, beginning immediately. I want every warrior on Tygokor running the new protocols within 2 hours. He looked at Torith. Design a field test. I want confirmation of that velocity threshold before we commit to doctrine. Then he looked at Worf. And I want you back in that cell, he said. Not as an interrogator, as something else. He chose the next word with unusual care for a Klingon general. As a student. Worf raised an eyebrow. They assess everything, Martok said. Then let us be assessed accurately. If Bashar Saras believes Klingon warriors are worth understanding, we will show him exactly what we are. And while he is busy forming his conclusions, the scarred side of Martok's face pulled into something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same general territory. We will be forming ours. The Romulan warbird Valdor's shadow had been running silent for 11 days. Cloaked at the edge of the Tygokor system, holding position with the disciplined stillness of a predator that had learned patience as a survival mechanism, Sub-Commander Velexa had watched the entire Eastern Wall engagement through passive sensor arrays so sensitive they could detect the heat differential between a Klingon warrior's forehead ridges at 200 kilometers. She had watched the ornithopters deploy. She had watched the shield belts absorb disruptor fire. She had watched 3,000 soldiers who had never heard of the Romulan Star Empire conduct themselves with a battlefield efficiency that made her skin prickle with something she would have been professionally embarrassed to call admiration. She had filed 4 encrypted reports to the Tal Shiar Directorate on Romulus in 11 days. The first 3 had received acknowledgement signals. The 4th had received something she had never seen in 12 years of intelligence work. A direct response from Proconsul Neryl's office, bypassing the standard Tal Shiar chain of command entirely, instructing her to maintain position, collect everything, and under no circumstances make contact with either the Klingons or the unidentified force until further orders arrived. Further orders had arrived 6 hours ago in the form of a Tal Shiar agent named Director Tomalak. Not the Admiral, a different Tomalak, which the Romulan naming conventions occasionally produced with inconvenient results, who had materialized in her ready room via a transport beam from a second warbird she hadn't known was in the system until it decloaked directly off her port bow. Director Tomalak was a thin man with the particular quality of stillness that Velexa associated with people who had spent their careers deciding other people's fates. He reviewed her sensor data for 2 hours without speaking. Then he said, "The shield technology. Holtzman field generation," Velexa said. "Personal scale. Self-contained power cells. Effective against all directed energy weapons we have on record, including disruptors and plasma weapons. Permeable to slow-moving physical objects. Impermeable to disruptors," Tomalak repeated, in the tone of someone turning an object over in his hands to examine it from every angle. "Starfleet phasers? By the physical principles involved, yes. The field operates on kinetic velocity discrimination, not energy-type discrimination. Any directed energy weapon would be stopped." Tomalak was quiet for a moment. Through the warbird's forward viewport, Tygocor's fortress moon turned slowly against the starfield, the night side scattered with the orange pinpoints of burning structures where the Sardaukar had pushed the perimeter inward another 2 kilometers during the previous cycle. "If the Romulan Star Empire possessed that technology," Tomalak said carefully, "in sufficient quantity, deployed across our fleet's ground forces, the Federation's advantage in directed energy weapons becomes irrelevant," Velexa said. "Klingon disruptors become irrelevant. Any ground engagement becomes," she chose her word, "negotiable, on our terms, exclusively." Tomalak nodded slowly. "We need a sample, a belt generator or sufficient sensor data to reverse engineer the field principles. Preferably both." He turned from the viewport. "The Klingons will be sending a significant military response. The Enterprise-D is already en route. We intercepted Starfleet's course change 6 hours ago. When Picard arrives, the situation will become diplomatically complicated in ways that make acquisition more difficult." He looked at her with the flat assessment of a man to whom other people's complications were primarily logistical problems. "We have a window. The Sardaukar will not negotiate," Velexa said. "I have been watching them for 11 days. They do not negotiate from positions of incomplete information. They assess first. Any approach we make now, before they have formed their evaluation of this region's power structure, will be read as weakness or desperation. Then we don't approach them," Tomalak said. "We approach the Klingons." Velexa looked at him. "Specifically," he continued, "we approach the Klingon officer who has been spending time alone with their prisoner. The one in the Starfleet uniform." He brought up a sensor capture on her console. Worf entering the detention block, sensor feeds conveniently dark inside, emerging 90 minutes later with a shoulder wound that the internal medical scanners registered as blade-inflicted. A Klingon who serves the Federation. A man divided by 2 loyalties. Those are the most useful kind. "You want to turn Worf?" "I want to offer him a perspective," Tomalak said smoothly. "The Sardaukar represent a threat to the entire Alpha Quadrant if they establish a stable dimensional conduit. The Federation and the Klingon Empire together lack the strategic flexibility to contain that threat. The Romulan Star Empire has resources and intelligence networks that could provide options. All we ask in return is access. A sensor reading, a technical file." He smiled thinly. "We are simply proposing cooperation among civilized powers facing a common danger. He will see through it immediately." "Of course he will. He is not the target of the deception." Tomalak adjusted his sleeve with the practiced fastidiousness of a man who found disorder in small things deeply offensive. "He is the messenger. What he carries back to Picard is the important thing. The idea that the Romulans are willing to cooperate. That plants a seed of uncertainty in Picard's mind about unilateral action. While Picard is considering our offer, we are already inside their sensor perimeter collecting what we need. Velexa studied the sensor capture of Worf for a long moment. There is another variable, she said. The Sardaukar prisoner. Whatever passed between them in that cell, he went in as an interrogator and came out as something else. That relationship has value we haven't fully mapped yet. She looked at Tomalak. If the Sardaukar's assessment process identifies individual warriors as worth understanding, and if Worf is being positioned as a point of contact, then the Sardaukar may be developing their own diplomatic channel, Tomalak said. He went still in the way of someone revising a calculation mid-process. Independently of both Starfleet and the Klingon High Council, which means the power structure of this situation is less fixed than we assumed. Outside the viewport, another section of Tygocor's outer perimeter went dark as a Sardaukar fireteam consolidated their hold on the northern approach road. The chanting had not stopped in 31 hours. Through the Warbird's passive acoustic sensors, filtered and amplified across the distance, it arrived as a vibration more than a sound, steady, patient, utterly without urgency. Tomalak listened to it for a moment with the expression of a man hearing something he recognized despite never having heard it before. They are not in a hurry, he said quietly. No, Velexa agreed. They have never needed to be. The tunnels beneath Tygocor's inner citadel were old enough that their architects had been dead for 6 centuries. They predated the fortress itself, carved during the early Imperial period when Tygokor was a mining installation rather than a military honor world, when the moon's dense stone had been valued for the dilithium traces threaded through its geological strata rather than for its strategic position. The dilithium had been exhausted within a generation. The tunnels remained, incorporated into successive construction phases with the pragmatic Klingon approach to infrastructure that valued function over aesthetics and saw no reason to fill in passages that might someday prove useful. General Korvik had proved them useful approximately 4 hours ago, when the Sardaukar northern advance had cut off surface access between the inner citadel and the secondary weapons cache in the fortress's eastern annex. The tunnels provided an alternate route, cramped, poorly lit, smelling of mineral dust and 6 centuries of Klingon occupation, but navigable by soldiers who didn't mind moving in single file through darkness. He had taken 12 warriors and gone himself, because Korvik was the kind of general who led from the front on principle and from the front in practice and had never found a satisfying distinction between the two. They found the Sardaukar fire team in Tunnel Junction 7. 6 soldiers, moving in the same geometric formation Korvik had observed on the eastern wall, 2 forward, 2 flanking, 2 rear security, navigating the tunnel system with handheld light sources that cast sharp, directional beams rather than the diffuse illumination of Klingon equipment. They had found the tunnel entrance through methods Korvik didn't have time to analyze. What mattered was that they were here, moving toward the weapons cache from the opposite direction, which meant either they had mapped the tunnel system from external geological scans or they had found an entrance Korvik didn't know about. Both possibilities were alarming in different ways. The tunnel junction was 3 meters wide and 2.5 meters high, large enough for Klingon warriors built like Korvik to move at full stride, too cramped for the ornithopter support that had made the Sardaukar's surface operations so devastatingly effective. No air cover. No field of fire long enough to make energy weapons tactically dominant. No room for the geometric fireteam formations that distributed threat response across multiple angles. Just stone walls and darkness and 12 Klingons and 6 Sardaukar and the specific quality of silence that precedes violence by exactly 1 breath. Korvik made a decision in the half-second before that silence ended. He did not reach for his disruptor. He drew his mek'leth and charged. What followed was the most honest fight Korvik had experienced in 30 years of warfare. No shields absorbed his opening strike. The tunnel was too narrow for the Sardaukar to bring their shield belt generators fully online without the fields overlapping and creating the destructive Holtzman interaction that their own doctrine prohibited in confined spaces. The lead Sardaukar met his mek'leth with a kinjal in a bind that sent sparks off both blades and drove Korvik's shoulder into the tunnel wall with enough force to crack stone. Korvac used the wall as a brace and drove forward with his legs, converting the impact into momentum, and they went down together in a grapple that rolled through the junction with complete disregard for the battle erupting around them. Klingon warriors and Sardaukar soldiers filled the tunnel in a collision of bodies and blades that was too close and too chaotic for either side's tactical training to fully govern. This was not the Eastern Wall, not the Sardaukar's preferred engagement geometry, not the Klingon warriors' preferred open-ground charge. This was something older than doctrine, fought in the dark with whatever each fighter's body and instinct could produce without the scaffolding of training to support them. It was, Korvac thought in the fractured clarity of close combat, the most purely honest test he had experienced since his first blade training as a child. He and the Sardaukar lead fighter separated from the general melee by mutual and unspoken agreement, pressing into a side passage where the fighting was less dense. The Sardaukar was bleeding from a cut above his eye. Korvac's first mek'leth strike had connected partially before the bind, and Korvac had 2 broken ribs from the wall impact and a deep bruise across his weapon arm that was making his grip unreliable. They faced each other in the narrow passage with the particular quality of attention that exists between 2 fighters who have been briefly entangled and have spent that time taking each other's full measure. The Sardaukar soldier said something in his language. The universal translator was not present. Korvac understood nothing of the specific words. He understood everything of the tone. It was the same tone Korvac used when he told a promising young warrior that they had potential worth developing. Assessment not as prelude to dismissal but as prelude to investment. The Sardaukar was not telling him he was a worthy opponent. He was telling him he was a worthy subject, someone worth the effort of full engagement rather than the efficient dispatch of a lesser threat. Korvac had never been so simultaneously complimented and infuriated in his life. They fought for 7 minutes in that side passage. The junction behind them went quiet. Not the quiet of one side's annihilation but the specific quiet of mutual exhaustion, of 2 forces that had hit each other at full force and found the impact approximately equal. When Korvac finally heard Klingon voices calling his name with the urgency of soldiers who needed their general functional, he and the Sardaukar broke apart by the same unspoken agreement that had separated them from the general melee. The Sardaukar looked at him, blood running freely from the eye cut now, soaking into the collar of his battle armor. Breathing hard but controlled, the breath disciplined even in extremity. He pressed his right fist against his chest, a gesture Korvac didn't recognize but whose meaning arrived through context with complete clarity. Not surrender. Not salute in any conventional military sense. Acknowledgement, one craftsman to another. Korvac, after a moment that cost him more pride than he expected, returned it. They retreated in opposite directions into the dark, and for a long moment the tunnel junction held only the smell of blood and stone dust and the guttering light sources dropped by the fallen, casting long shadows that could have belonged to warriors from any universe, any era, any war that had ever been fought in the dark by people who were very good at it. Korvac reached the weapons cache. The Sardaukar fire team did not pursue. Later, reviewing the junction's structural sensors, the only recording devices that had captured any of it. Martok watched the 7-minute passage fight 3 times without comment. Then he filed it in the tactical database under a classification that didn't previously exist, which he created specifically for this engagement. He labeled it, Reference, What Equal Looks Like. The transmission came through the dimensional rift at 0347 hours, ship time. It arrived not as a standard subspace signal. The rift's energy profile was incompatible with subspace carrier wave propagation in ways that data was still constructing mathematical models to describe, but as a direct electromagnetic pulse, modulated in a frequency pattern that suggested deliberate encoding rather than natural phenomenon. The Enterprise-D's communications array caught it on automated monitoring while the Gamma Shift crew was running standard approach protocols toward the Sardaukar system, still 4 hours out at Warp 8. Ensign Taylor, Gamma Shift Operations Officer, flagged it immediately and woke Data, who woke Picard, who arrived on the bridge in 7 minutes with the particular quality of alertness that senior Starfleet captains developed. The ability to transition from sleep to full command cognition without the intermediate stage of gradual orientation that most humans required. Data had partially decoded it by the time Picard reached his station. The signal originates from within the dimensional rift itself, Data said, or more precisely from the far side of the rift's aperture, the originating universe. It has been amplified through the rift's energy structure in a manner suggesting the sender understands the rift's physics well enough to use it as a transmission medium. He brought the decoded fragment onto the main viewscreen. The language matrix is consistent with the speech patterns I extracted from the Sardaukar sensor recordings. The same civilization. Picard studied the transmission fragments. Partially decoded, they resolved into clipped, formal language, the same stripped-down precision Worf had described from his session with Bashar Sarraz. Not diplomatic language, not military communique language in any conventional sense. Something in between, the language of an institution that had never needed to distinguish between diplomacy and military command because it had never encountered a situation where force alone was insufficient. "What does it say?" Picard asked. "The full transmission is directed at the cohort commander on Sardaukar," Data said. "However, because it was broadcast through the rift rather than targeted transmission, it is receivable by any sufficiently sensitive array in the system." He paused in the way that indicated he was choosing phrasing carefully. "The Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV is ordering a full assessment report. He is aware the cohort has made contact with an unknown civilization. He wants a complete evaluation of military capacity, technological sophistication, and another precise pause. Subjugation potential." The bridge was quiet. "Subjugation potential," Picard repeated. "Yes, Captain. The transmission also references a second wave force being staged at the rift's origin point. The phrasing implies a substantially larger deployment than the initial 3,000. The specific numbers are encoded in a cipher layer I have not yet fully resolved, but contextual analysis suggests a minimum of 30,000 additional soldiers, with armored support and what appear to be large-scale atmospheric assault platforms." Picard turned this information over in the measured way of a man who had learned that the first 60 seconds of processing a piece of extremely bad news were the most important 60 seconds, because everything that followed was built on the foundation laid in that initial response. "How long before the rift is stable enough to support a second wave deployment?" "Based on current energy flux readings, the rift will reach full stabilization in approximately 19 hours. Data looked at him. "At that point it will be capable of supporting continuous transit of large-scale forces and equipment." 19 hours. Picard clasped his hands behind his back and looked at the viewscreen, where Sardaukar system was still 4 hours distant and the rift's energy signature pulsed at the edge of long-range sensor resolution like a wound in the fabric of space that had not yet decided whether to heal or widen. "Get me Chancellor Gowron," he said. The communication channel to Konos took 11 minutes to establish through the interference the rift was generating across the system's subspace bands. When Gowron's face appeared on the viewscreen, he was not in the Great Hall. He was aboard a Klingon battlecruiser, the Sword of Khalas, his personal flagship, and the starfield visible through the viewport behind him was moving, which meant the Fourth Fleet was already underway. Picard relayed Data's transmission analysis without preamble. Gowron listened with the focused intensity of a commander absorbing tactical intelligence. The characteristic wide-eyed burn of his attention narrowed to something almost clinical. When Picard finished, Gowron said, 30,000. Minimum, possibly significantly more, with the shield technology. Presumably, yes. Gowron was quiet for 4 seconds. The Fourth Fleet consists of 32 battlecruisers and their support elements. Against 30,000 shielded ground troops with atmospheric assault capability, he stopped. Picard recognized the quality of the pause, a commander running force calculations and arriving at a number he found professionally unacceptable. "The rift must be closed," Picard said. "Agreed. Before the 19-hour stabilization window." "Also agreed." Gowron's eyes found Picard's through the viewscreen with the directness of a man who had decided to say something he would not normally say. "Can it be done?" "I don't know yet," Picard said, with the particular honesty that he considered the first obligation of command. "Data is working on rift mechanics. The variables are unlike anything in our database." He paused. "I also need to discuss the Romulan presence in the system. Gowron's expression shifted. You know about the warbirds. We detected their cloak signatures 6 hours ago. 2 vessels, holding position at the system's edge. Picard kept his voice level. Their interest in the shield technology is not difficult to infer. The Romulans will not act openly while the Enterprise is present, Gowron said, with the confident dismissiveness of a man who had spent decades navigating Romulan political behavior. They will maneuver, offer something that costs them nothing to obtain something that costs us everything. Standard tall sheer methodology. They've already made contact with Worf, Picard said. This produced the longest silence yet from Gowron. 3 full seconds of the kind of stillness that in a Klingon indicated not calm but the internal equivalent of a controlled detonation being very carefully not detonated. Worf told you this himself, Gowron said. It was not a question. Immediately, along with the full content of what was communicated, Picard allowed himself a small, precise beat. He is not the kind of officer who requires reminding about where his loyalties are situated. No, Gowron said slowly. He is not. Something moved through his expression that Picard couldn't fully read. Complicated and layered in the way of a Klingon chancellor processing a Klingon warrior's honor through the lens of political inconvenience. The tall sheer approach was clumsy. They are frightened. Frightened people with cloaking devices and a strategic objective are more dangerous than confident ones, Picard said. We need to move quickly on the rift closure before their patience runs out and they attempt acquisition by other means. What do you need from the Empire? Picard had prepared this answer during the 11 minutes the channel was establishing. Martok's cooperation on Tygocore, access to everything the garrison has learned about Sardaukar technology and tactics. And, he paused, Worf's continued access to Bashar Sarah's. Gowron's eyes narrowed. You want to negotiate with them. I want to understand them, Picard said carefully. There is a difference. Closing the rift solves the immediate problem of the second wave. It does not solve the problem of 3,000 Sardaukar already in Klingon space, in possession of technology that 2 major powers are now willing to compromise their principles to acquire. He looked at Gowron steadily. We have 19 hours to close a dimensional rift, manage a Romulan intelligence operation, and find a way to talk to soldiers who have never in their history recommended withdrawal. Gowron studied him through the viewscreen with the ancient Klingon instinct for assessing the warrior behind the words. You believe it can be done, Gowron said. Not the rift closure. The other thing. Worf believes Bashar Sarah's is capable of it, Picard said. That is sufficient for me to try. Picard arrived on Tygocore with 4 hours remaining on Data's 19-hour window. The Enterprise-D had dropped out of warp at the system's edge with the particular controlled urgency of a vessel whose captain had already decided on his priorities and was moving through them in sequence. Transporters were unreliable within 15,000 kilometers of the rift's energy distortion field, which meant a shuttlecraft descent through Tygocore's atmosphere. A 20-minute approach that gave Picard time to review Worf's complete session transcripts with Bashar Sarah's, Data's rift mechanics analysis, and the latest tactical reports from Martok's expanded perimeter defense. The tactical reports alone occupied 37 PADDs. In 4 days of continuous engagement, the Sardaukar had pushed Klingon defensive lines inward by 11 kilometers on 3 fronts while sustaining what Martok's analysis estimated as approximately 12% casualties. A figure that was, by any conventional military calculus, extraordinarily low for an offensive operation conducted against veteran defenders with home terrain advantage. The modified grappling doctrine Torith had developed was producing results, but results measured in individual engagements rather than strategic momentum. For every Sardaukar fireteam that a Klingon grappling unit neutralized, 2 more fireteams consolidated the gains the first had made before being neutralized. The Sardaukar were not losing ground. They were not gaining it rapidly. They were, with the systematic patience of soldiers who had been doing this across 10,000 worlds for generations, simply making themselves permanent. Martok met Picard at the shuttle bay with the expression of a general who had been awake for 30 hours and had decided to treat this as irrelevant. Picard, no honorific. Martok had always communicated respect through directness rather than formality. Data's rift analysis, does it give us a method? A theoretical one, Picard said, matching his pace as they moved through the Citadel's corridors. A precisely modulated antimatter pulse, delivered at the rift's geometric center, could collapse the aperture before it reaches full stabilization. The Enterprise's deflector dish can generate the required modulation. He paused. However, the rift's energy structure means the pulse must be delivered from inside the distortion field perimeter, within approximately 8,000 kilometers of the aperture. Martok processed this. That puts the Enterprise inside weapons range of anything coming through the rift. Yes. And if the antimatter pulse destabilizes the rift catastrophically rather than closing it cleanly? Data estimates a 14% probability of that outcome. Picard kept his voice steady. He also estimates that if the rift reaches full stabilization and the second wave deploys, the probability of successfully defending Klingon space with available forces drops to approximately 6%. Martok was quiet for 3 steps. Acceptable risk. I thought you'd say that. They reached the corridor outside the detention block, where Worf was waiting with the particular quality of contained energy that Picard recognized as his officer's version of deep preoccupation, standing still while thinking very fast. Beside him, unexpectedly, stood General Korvik, his forearm freshly wrapped, his expression carrying the complicated layers that Picard had been reading in the sensor reports without being able to fully interpret until seeing it in person. Bashar Saras has made a request, Worf said without preamble. Picard raised an eyebrow. What kind of request? He wants to speak with the commander of the vessel that arrived this morning. He identified the Enterprise-D by name from the sensor data his soldiers have been collecting. He knows who I serve. Worf's jaw tightened slightly. He also knows about the rift stabilization window. He has been tracking it independently through whatever sensor capability his cohort's equipment provides. He knows about the second wave, Picard said. He has known since the original deployment. The second wave is standard Sardaukar campaign doctrine. The initial cohort assesses and softens resistance. The main force deploys once the assessment is complete. Worf paused. He has not filed his assessment report. The corridor was quiet for a moment. He's been withholding it, Korvik said, in the tone of someone who had been sitting with a realization for several hours and had decided to share it because the alternative was carrying it alone. Since the tunnel junction, I've been thinking about it since Martok showed me the engagement records. The Sardaukar have sufficient combat data to complete a subjugation assessment 3 times over. They've been on this moon for 4 days. Saras should have transmitted his report within the first 24 hours by their doctrine. He looked at Worf. He hasn't, which means he's choosing not to. Why? Picard asked. Because the assessment isn't complete, Worf said. Not by his standards. What he has observed so far, the Eastern Wall, the tunnel engagements, the tactical adaptations Martok's forces have developed, has given him data he wasn't expecting. He needs to understand what it means before he can honestly evaluate it. Worf looked at Picard with the directness of an officer making a recommendation he believed in completely. He is a man of absolute professional integrity, Captain. Within a framework that is brutal and imperial and entirely foreign to Federation values, within that framework, he will not file a report he doesn't believe is accurate. And he does not yet understand what he is looking at. Picard held Worf's gaze for a long moment. Behind him, through the Citadel's stone walls, the distant rhythm of the Sardaukar chanting moved through the rock like a geological pulse. Then let's give him something worth understanding, Picard said. Bashar Saras stood when Picard entered the detention block, which was either courtesy or the instinct of a soldier who didn't remain seated when an unknown variable entered his environment. Possibly both. He was a lean, precise man whose stillness had the quality Picard associated with exceptional chess players. Not the stillness of passivity but of someone processing several moves simultaneously while showing nothing. Picard sat down across from him without preamble and without guards, which produced a brief, almost imperceptible recalibration in Saras's expression, a fractional adjustment of assessment parameters. You are the commander of the vessel, Saras said. The universal translator had refined significantly in 4 days of exposure. His words arrived with clarity if not warmth. Jean-Luc Picard, captain of the USS Enterprise. I represent the United Federation of Planets. You do not represent the Klingons. No, though I work alongside them. The distinction matters to both sides. Picard kept his voice level. I know about the second wave. I know about the assessment report you haven't filed. I know you have been on this moon for 4 days and have found something you weren't expecting to find. Sarah's regarded him. You are direct. I find it saves time. We have approximately 4 hours before I attempt to close the dimensional rift. I would prefer to spend some of that time in honest conversation rather than tactical positioning. Picard leaned forward slightly. I am going to tell you something true, Bashar. The rift closure will work or it will not. If it works, your second wave cannot deploy, and you have 3,000 soldiers in a hostile system with no resupply and no reinforcement. If it doesn't work, 30,000 Sardaukar enter Klingon space and begin a campaign that will eventually draw in the full military capacity of the Federation, the Klingon Empire, and possibly the Romulan Star Empire simultaneously. He paused. I have spent my career finding third options. I would like to discuss whether one exists here. Sarah's was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that was not absence of thought but presence of very concentrated thought. In 10,000 years of campaigns across our universe, he said finally, the Sardaukar have encountered 11 civilizations that the Padishah Emperor ultimately chose not to subjugate. What did those 11 civilizations have in common? They demonstrated something the Emperor valued more than their territory or their resources. Sarah's looked at Picard with the flat assessment of absolute professional honesty. They demonstrated that the cost of their subjugation would exceed the value of their submission. Not through military capacity alone. He paused, and the translator worked briefly with a word that had no direct equivalent. Through the quality of their refusal. The manner in which they chose to resist. Picard held his gaze. And what have you found here? Sarah's looked past him, through the cell wall, towards some internal accounting that Picard could not observe but could recognize by its shape. The look of a professional reckoning honestly with data that has changed his conclusions. I have found warriors who adapt faster than any soldiers I have encountered in 30 years of campaigning, he said quietly. I have found a general who fought one of my sergeants to a standstill in a tunnel and then acknowledged the outcome without shame. I have found a Klingon who serves an institution that values reason over glory, and does not find this diminishing. His eyes returned to Picard. And I have found a captain who walked into this room without guards to have an honest conversation with a man whose soldiers are currently occupying sections of his ally's fortress. Something moved in his expression that was the closest thing to warmth Picard had seen from him. The Emperor values what is difficult to replace. Then perhaps, Picard said carefully, he should be told that what he has found here cannot be replaced at all. The Battle of Sardaukar began at 0614 hours with a sound like the universe clearing its throat. The dimensional rift, responding to the Enterprise-D's approach at high impulse with the antimatter pulse sequence charging in the deflector array, destabilized along its outer aperture in a cascade of energy discharges that lit the Sardaukar system like a second sun for approximately 4 seconds. Every sensor array in the system, Klingon, Romulan, Sardaukar, registered the event simultaneously and drew the same immediate tactical conclusion. The window was closing faster than anyone had calculated, and everything that was going to happen in this system was going to happen now. Data had predicted this possibility with a 31% probability estimate. Picard had filed it under acceptable variance and proceeded anyway, which was either command courage or command stubbornness, and he had long since stopped trying to determine which. Rift aperture destabilizing ahead of projection, data reported from Ops, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man delivering urgent information with complete emotional neutrality. Estimated time to either full stabilization or collapse now reduced to 47 minutes. The cascade is accelerating the process in both possible directions simultaneously. Can we still deliver the pulse? Picard asked. Yes. However, the optimal delivery window has narrowed from a range of approximately 60 minutes to a range of approximately 11 minutes. We must be at the geometric center of the distortion field within a fractional pause. 9 minutes and 14 seconds from now. Helm, maximum impulse. Captain, data again, with a quality of additional weight that Picard had learned to treat as a signal. The rift destabilization has triggered a response from the far side. Something is coming through. The main viewscreen showed it before the sensor data fully resolved, a shape emerging from the rift's churning aperture with the slow, massive inevitability of a geological event. Not soldiers, not ornithopters, something that the Enterprise's recognition database spent 2.3 seconds attempting to classify before data provided the identification manually. Highliner, he said, or the nearest equivalent available sensor data can construct. A Guild Navigator transport vessel from the originating universe. Carrying, another fractional pause, longer this time, which on data indicated genuine computational strain. Carrying what the Rift's mass sensors register as approximately 47,000 personnel and significant quantities of mechanized equipment. The vessel is using the Rift's own energy gradient as a transit medium. It will have fully transited in approximately 22 minutes. 22 minutes. 9 minutes to optimal pulse delivery window. 11 minutes total before the window close. Picard processed this in approximately 1 second. Red alert, he said. All hands to battle stations. On Tygocor's surface, the chanting stopped. It stopped with the abruptness of a switch being thrown. 3,000 voices that had maintained their rhythm for 96 hours going silent simultaneously, as though the soldiers producing the sound had received a signal that required every available cognitive resource for something other than ritual. Which, Martok realized as he pulled up the surface sensor feed in the war room, was precisely what had happened. The Sardaukar cohort on Tygocor's surface was redeploying. Not retreating, not advancing, redeploying with the geometric precision that had characterized everything they did. Fire teams pulling back from forward positions, consolidating into a defensive perimeter around the rift's surface egress point, the ornithopters that had been conducting continuous patrol sweeps banking hard and returning to formation above the consolidated position. It happened in under 4 minutes, 3,000 soldiers reorganizing their entire tactical disposition with the fluid, wordless coordination of a single organism responding to a single stimulus. They know about the Highliner, Torith said. They are protecting the egress point, Martok said. When the second wave deploys, they want a secured surface position ready to receive them. He looked at the repositioned Sardaukar perimeter on the tactical display, 3,000 soldiers in a tight defensive formation around a 2-kilometer radius, shield belts active, Kinjal-armed fire teams interlocked in overlapping fields of coverage. They have stopped trying to take the fortress. They are trying to hold the landing zone. Korvik studied the display. If the second wave deploys to that position with atmospheric assault platforms, Tygokor falls within 6 hours, Martok said flatly. And then the campaign for the Klingon home systems begins. He looked at his communications officer. Get me Picard. The channel was already open. We are aware, Picard said, his voice arriving through the comm with the controlled urgency of a man managing several simultaneous crises with deliberate prioritization. Martok, I need you to hold your forces back from the Sardaukar perimeter. Hold back, Martok repeated, in the tone of a Klingon general presented with a tactical instruction that conflicted with every instinct he possessed. If the Fourth Fleet engages the Sardaukar ground position now, Saraz's cohort will have no choice but to fight to the last soldier. That is a battle we cannot afford to conduct while simultaneously attempting rift closure. A brief pause in which Picard's background comm traffic suggested the Enterprise bridge was operating at full emergency tempo. Bashar Saraz and I reached an understanding in that detention block. I need him alive and in command of his cohort for that understanding to have any operational value. And if the Highliner completes transit before you close the rift, then we fight, Picard said simply. But not yet. The Valdor's shadow decloaked at 0619 hours. It emerged from its cloaking field 11,000 kilometers off the Enterprise-D's port bow with the particular quality of a move that had been held in reserve until the moment of maximum strategic impact. Not an attack, not an offer of assistance, but a declaration of presence at a moment when presence itself was a form of leverage. Director Tomalak's voice arrived on the Enterprise's open channel with the smooth precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment. Captain Picard, the Romulan Star Empire has been observing this situation with considerable interest. We are prepared to offer assistance with your rift closure operation. A beat, perfectly timed. In exchange for a conversation about certain technological matters. Picard's response was immediate. Not now, Tomalak. The window is closing, Captain. I need you to clear my approach vector, Picard said, with a quality of focused intensity that cut through the channel's subspace interference with complete clarity. If your vessel is within 8,000 kilometers of the rift's distortion field perimeter when I deliver the antimatter pulse, the interaction with your cloaking device's quantum signature will produce a feedback cascade that data estimates will destroy both ships. Another beat, precisely as long as Tomalak's had been. I would find that outcome professionally unsatisfying. Move your vessel, Sub-Commander. 6 seconds of silence. The Valdor's shadow moved. 7 minutes and 40 seconds into the 9-minute window, the Enterprise-D crossed the 8,000-kilometer threshold into the rift's distortion field, and every system on the ship registered the transition simultaneously. The viewscreen filled with the roiling energy architecture of a dimensional aperture at near stabilization, colors that had no business existing in the visible spectrum, geometric patterns that the human visual cortex processed as deeply wrong in ways that bypassed aesthetic judgment and reached directly into something more primitive. Through the aperture, visible now at this range as something more than a sensor abstraction, the highliner hung in the dimensional in-between, vast, dark, filling the aperture's cross-section like a stopper in a bottle, its transit 43% complete. Deflector array charged, data reported. Pulse modulation locked. Awaiting your order, Captain. Picard looked at the viewscreen. At the highliner completing its transit. At the 3,000 Sardaukar soldiers on Tygocor's surface whose Bashar had told him 11 civilizations had been spared because of the quality of their refusal. At the 47,000 soldiers about to pour through a dimensional wound into a galaxy that hadn't asked for them and wasn't equipped to receive them. At the universe presenting him with a moment in which every available option had a cost he didn't want to pay. Data, he said, before I give that order, is there any modulation variant that closes the rift without destroying the highliner? Traps it in transit rather than eliminating it? Data processed for 1.8 seconds. Yes. A phase variance of 0.003 in the pulse modulation would collapse the aperture around the highliner rather than before it, sealing it within the dimensional membrane. The vessel and its occupants would be suspended in the dimensional substrate, not destroyed, but inaccessible from either universe. Effectively removed from the conflict. A precise pause. The 47,000 personnel aboard would survive. They would simply be elsewhere. Somewhere between universes, Picard said quietly. Indefinitely with current technology. Though future developments in dimensional mechanics might eventually provide retrieval options. Picard was quiet for 3 seconds. The viewscreen showed the highliner's transit reaching 51%. Fire, he said. Phase variance 0.003. The antimatter pulse left the Enterprise-D's deflector dish as a beam of coherent energy that the viewscreen's filters rendered as a column of cold white light driving directly into the heart of the dimensional rift. It hit the aperture's geometric center at 0623 hours and 14 seconds, and what happened next occurred across approximately 0.4 seconds of objective time that every crew member present would spend the rest of their careers attempting to accurately describe. The rift folded, not collapsed, folded, like a piece of paper being pressed flat from both sides simultaneously, the dimensional membrane contracting around the highliner's transiting bulk with a geometric precision that suggested the universe was, on some level, relieved to close this particular wound. The highliner vanished from the viewscreen not with an explosion but with a withdrawal. There one moment, gone the next, taken somewhere between universes with the 47,000 soldiers aboard, suspended in dimensional amber while the rift sealed itself behind them with the finality of a door closing. The silence on the Enterprise bridge lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then every console on the ship registered the after effects simultaneously, energy discharges, subspace harmonics, the residual signature of a dimensional aperture that had existed for 5 days and was now, completely and irreversibly, gone. Data looked up from his console. Rift closure confirmed. Complete seal achieved. Highliner suspended in dimensional substrate is calculated. He paused. No Sardaukar forces remain in the dimensional membrane. The 3,000 personnel currently on Tygocor's surface are, a precise word, stranded. Picard looked at the empty space where the rift had been and felt the weight of 47,000 lives suspended between universes because he had chosen that over the alternative. Open a channel to Bashar Saras, he said. The channel to Bashar Saras opened against a background of complete silence. Not the tactical silence of a force regrouping after contact, not the organizational silence of soldiers awaiting orders, the deep, specific silence of 3,000 warriors who had simultaneously received information that restructured every assumption their campaign had been built upon. The Sardaukar perimeter around Tygocor's rift egress point held its formation with the same geometric precision it had maintained for 4 days, shield belts still active, Kinjals still at the ready, ornithopters still circling overhead in their patrol patterns. The discipline was extraordinary. Soldiers who had just learned they were stranded in a hostile universe, with no resupply and no reinforcement and no path home, continuing to execute their last confirmed orders with absolute professional fidelity because that was what they were. Picard had been thinking, during the 4 minutes it took to establish the channel, about what it meant to be that kind of soldier. What it cost, what it built. Bashar Saras, he said. Captain Picard. The voice through the comm was the same, level, precise, stripped of everything that wasn't essential. The rift is closed. Yes. The Highliner, suspended in the dimensional substrate. Not destroyed. 47,000 lives preserved, including whatever personnel were aboard. Picard kept his voice as level as Saras's. They are inaccessible from either universe with current technology. I want you to know the distinction was deliberate. A pause that lasted long enough for Picard to count his own heartbeats. 4 of them. You chose the more difficult option, Saras said. The more difficult option was the only one consistent with what I believe, Picard said. Which is, I think, something you understand. Another pause. Shorter. Yes. Your situation has changed significantly, Bashar. You have 3,000 soldiers, equipment for a sustained ground campaign, and no path back to your universe with available technology. The Klingon Empire is deploying its 4th fleet to this system. The Romulan Star Empire has 2 warbirds observing from the system's edge with intentions I think we both understand. Picard paused. And you have an incomplete assessment report that your Emperor will never receive. I am aware of all of this, Saras said, with the dry precision of a man confirming he has read the document being summarized to him. Then I would like to have the conversation we began in that detention block, Picard said. About third options. The meeting happened on Tygocor's surface, in the fortress's outer courtyard, neutral ground in the sense that neither side controlled it comfortably, which Picard had specifically requested because he found that genuine negotiation happened in spaces where neither party felt entirely at home. He came with Worf and Data. Saras came with 2 sergeants and, unexpectedly, the soldier from the tunnel junction, the one Korvac had fought for 7 minutes in the side passage and exchanged the chest-fist acknowledgement with afterward. When Korvac saw him across the courtyard he went very still for a moment, then crossed the space between them with the deliberate stride of a warrior who had decided something and was implementing the decision before his rational mind could argue him out of it. He pressed his fist against his chest. The Sardaukar sergeant looked at him for 1 second, then returned it. Martok, standing at Picard's shoulder, said nothing. But Picard felt something shift in the general's bearing, a fractional adjustment, the kind that in a person of Martok's experience indicated a conclusion being reached after long deliberation. Saras and Picard stood across a field table that Data had set up with a topographical display of the Tygocor system and the surrounding Klingon space. The afternoon sun of Tygocor's star cast long shadows across the courtyard stones, and the smell of the moon, mineral, cold, ancient in the way of places that had been contested for centuries, moved through the air between them. Your soldiers cannot go home, Picard said. Not today, not with anything we currently possess. He held Saras's gaze, but the Federation's understanding of dimensional mechanics has just expanded significantly, as a direct result of studying this rift. What took your guild navigators 10,000 years of development to achieve, we have now observed directly. I will not promise you a timeline, because I don't know one. But I will promise you that the question of how to reopen a dimensional aperture safely will be the subject of sustained Federation scientific attention, because 47,000 lives suspended between universes is not a permanent solution that I find acceptable. Sarah's studied him. You are offering to work toward returning my people home. I am telling you it will be a genuine priority, not a diplomatic courtesy. There is a difference. Picard paused. In exchange, I am asking for a ceasefire with the Klingon Empire. Immediate, complete, and maintained for as long as it takes to develop the dimensional transit technology. Your soldiers retain their weapons, their equipment, their organizational structure. They are not prisoners. They are, he chose the word carefully, guests, in a situation none of us chose and all of us must navigate together. Guests who happen to occupy 11 kilometers of Klingon fortress territory, Sarah said, with the dry precision that Picard was beginning to recognize as the Sardaukar equivalent of humor. A detail to be worked out in subsequent conversations, Picard said, matching his tone precisely. Something moved in Sarah's expression, a shift that was deeper than the fractional adjustments Picard had been reading for the past hour. Not warmth, exactly. Not trust, which was too large a word for what 4 days and one honest conversation could build between people from different universes. Something more specific and perhaps more durable. The recognition of a framework within which trust might eventually become possible. The Emperor's assessment doctrine, Sarah said slowly, exists because the Emperor believes that understanding what something is worth is more important than taking it quickly. A civilization taken before it is understood is a resource wasted. He looked at Picard, then at Worf, then across the courtyard to where Korvac and his tunnel junction sergeant stood in the specific proximity of people who have fought each other and found the experience unexpectedly clarifying. I have been on this moon for 4 days. I have more data than I need to file a subjugation assessment. He paused. I do not have enough data to file an accurate one. What would an accurate one require? Picard asked. More time, Sarah said. More observation. More, the translator worked briefly with the next word. More conversations like this one. He looked at Picard directly. The 11 civilizations the Emperor chose not to subjugate were not spared because they were too strong to defeat. They were spared because someone filed an honest report explaining what would be lost in the defeating. He was quiet for a moment. I have never filed that report. In 30 years of campaigns across 100 worlds, I have never encountered a civilization where the honest answer to the Emperor's question was anything other than a recommendation to proceed. The courtyard was quiet. Above them, an ornithopter completed its patrol circuit and banked away, its dragonfly wings catching the Tygocore sun. Until now? Picard asked. Sarah's was quiet for 4 seconds. The longest pause Picard had observed from him, longer even than the count of heartbeats after he learned the rift was closed. The Emperor values what is difficult to replace, he said finally. What I have found in this system is not difficult to replace. He looked at Picard with the absolute professional honesty of a man filing an internal assessment that would cost him something to file accurately. It is impossible to replace. Because it is not a thing. It is not a technology or a territory or a resource. He chose his final words with the same economy he applied to everything. It is a way of being in the universe. And the only way to take it would be to destroy it. Which would mean, you would no longer have what you came for, Picard said quietly. Yes, the ceasefire was signed, if signed was the right word for what happened, which was more that 2 men looked at each other across a field table on an ancient moon and reached a shared conclusion simultaneously. At 1147 hours, Tygocore local time. Martok appended his seal to the Federation record with the expression of a general who had won something he hadn't expected to win and wasn't entirely sure yet what to do with the victory. Gowron, reached by subspace from the Sword of Kallus still 3 hours out, listened to Picard's summary in complete silence and then said, with the quiet register that his advisors had learned to find more significant than his volume, tell the Bashar that the Klingon Empire does not forget a worthy enemy. Nor does it forget when a worthy enemy chooses a different path. Worf delivered the message personally. Sarah's received it without visible reaction, which Worf had come to understand meant he was processing something important. Director Tomalak's warbirds withdrew from the system at 1203 hours without communication. Velexa, in her final report to the Tal Shiar Directorate, noted that the shield belt acquisition objective had not been achieved, that both the Federation and the Klingon Empire had demonstrated an unexpected capacity for non-military resolution of a military crisis, and that the Sardaukar presence in the Alpha Quadrant represented a long-term variable of indeterminate strategic value. She filed this report with the particular satisfaction of an intelligence officer who had observed something genuinely new and had described it accurately. Tomalak read it twice, said nothing, and filed it under a classification that meant, watch and wait. The dimensional rift that had torn open the Tygokor system sealed itself so completely that within 72 hours, only the most sensitive Federation instruments could detect the residual scar tissue it left in the fabric of space. A faint subspace harmonic, barely above background noise, that Data described in his formal report as a whisper where a wound had been. The 3,000 Sardaukar soldiers of Bashar Saras's cohort established a permanent encampment on Tygokor's northern plateau, in the ruins of the fortress sections their assault had rendered uninhabitable. They rebuilt with the same systematic efficiency they brought to everything, not comfortable quarters but functional ones, structured around their unit formations and their rituals and the deep organizational logic of people for whom the cohort was the primary unit of identity. They maintained their weapons. They maintained their drills. They maintained the low rhythmic chanting that Klingon garrison soldiers eventually stopped finding unsettling and began, in certain late watch hours, finding almost companionable. General Korvik requested a formal combat exchange program within 30 days. Martok approved it with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for someone else to ask first. The Tunnel Junction Sergeant, whose name, rendered through the Universal Translator, was something close to Harvin, became the program's first Sardaukar instructor. He taught 17 Klingon warriors the Kinjal binding technique that had opened Korvik's forearm on the first day. 3 of them, Korvik noted in his after-action report, showed genuine aptitude. Worf remained on Tygokor for 6 weeks, filing regular reports to both Picard and the Klingon High Council, before returning to the Enterprise. His final session with Saras lasted 4 hours and was not recorded at either man's request. What Worf wrote in his personal log afterward was 3 sentences. He asked me how I serve 2 things at once without betraying either. I told him I asked myself the same question every day. He said, that is the answer. The Federation Science Institute opened a dedicated dimensional transit research division 11 days after the rift closure, funded at a level that left no ambiguity about institutional priority. Picard submitted a personal letter to the Institute's director, which was not standard protocol for a Starfleet captain and which the director received with the particular gravity of someone who understood that the 47,000 lives suspended between universes were not an abstraction to the man who had put them there. Bashar Saras never filed his assessment report. In the administrative records of the Sardaukar military apparatus, the Tygokor cohort remained listed as on active campaign status. A bureaucratic fiction that everyone involved maintained with the unspoken understanding that some situations required the paperwork to wait until the universe provided a category adequate to describe them. In the darkness between stars, where the rift had been, something that was not quite space and not quite anything else held 47,000 sleeping soldiers in dimensional suspension, waiting, as everything in the universe eventually waits, for someone to find a door. Whether that door leads to reconciliation or to the resumption of everything the ceasefire had paused, only time would tell. But somewhere on Tygokor's ancient stones, a Klingon general and a Sardaukar Bashar were sitting across a table in the ruins of a wall they had respectively defended and taken, sharing a meal that neither universe's protocol had a category for, conducting the oldest and most difficult negotiation in any civilization's history. The one where 2 peoples look at each other across everything that divides them and ask, with genuine uncertainty and genuine hope, what are we, now? Live long and prosper. More stories await.